Hey, 42 here. The National Library of Sweden is home to one of the largest book collections found anywhere on Earth today. There are over 18 million individual items in the library's extensive catalogue, many of which are extremely rare and valuable. But amongst this vast archive, one book stands above all others, and I mean that quite literally. This is the Codex Gigas, that's Latin for giant book, and it certainly lives up to its name. At almost a metre tall, weighing as much as an adult man, and with a total writing area large enough to cover an entire public swimming pool, it is the largest medieval manuscript in existence. Having been made in the early 13th century, it's also extremely old. Like many books of its kind, it contains the complete Latin Bible. But given its colossal dimensions, once that was finished, there was plenty of space left over for other things. Some, like the medical texts, obituaries, and complete encyclopedia, are fairly normal. Others are less normal. Tucked away amongst the pages of this towering tome are magic spells, mysterious formulas, and a set of detailed instructions on how to carry out an exorcism. And then there's this, a half-metre tall depiction of the devil himself. To call this illustration unusual would be the understatement of the 13th century, and I'm not just referring to those polka dot Y-fronts. Tens of thousands of medieval manuscripts can be found in libraries around the world today, but not a single one of them contains anything even remotely like this. The size, the detail, the decision to include a full-page depiction of the devil in the first place, well, it's highly irregular, to say the least. Given its size, the Codex Gigas was always going to be a famous book, but this bizarre illustration has seen it earn near legendary status, as well as a very fitting nickname, the Devil's Bible. So, who put it there, and why? The simple answer to that question is that we don't know for sure, but there is a theory, or should I say, a legend. You see, it isn't just the book itself that survived the last 8 centuries. Passed down along with it is a seriously creepy tale. 800 years ago, in a remote monastery in what was then Bohemia, a Benedictine monk was sentenced to death for committing a terrible crime. But this was no ordinary execution. The condemned monk was to be immured. Just in case you aren't up to date with your 13th century capital punishments, immurement is essentially death by live entombment. In this case, the monk would be bricked up inside the walls of his own monastery. Quite understandably, he wasn't overly thrilled about that prospect. So, in a last desperate attempt to earn his freedom, he vowed that with his last night on Earth, he would craft a book to honour the monastery, and not just any book, a mighty tome containing all human knowledge. Think of it like the 13th century version of Wikipedia. That very night, the monk got straight to work, but it didn't take him all that long to realise he might have overpromised a bit with the whole write an entire book in a single night thing. And, so desperate for help, he fell to his knees and he prayed. But he didn't offer this prayer up to God. No. He sent it special delivery first-class post straight to the underworld. Satan duly appeared and, in exchange for the monk's immortal soul, fashioned the greatest book the world had ever seen. That book was the Codex Gigas. Apparently, the devilish illustration was added afterwards by the monk, a tribute to the book's true author. And now for a quick ad from strawberry.me. Let me tell you about a friend of mine who started a podcast. He got about 6 months into the project and it was going really well. He'd released a few episodes. He had a small but consistent audience, but he started to wonder whether all that time over the past 6 months and all that effort had been completely wasted. Well, he and anyone else who is struggling with self-doubt or personal growth could really benefit from career coaching. Strawberry.me is a solution for affordable and accessible career coaching. When I tried strawberry.me, my coach helped me to better schedule my days. I have a tendency to work sporadically, where I jump from task to task, and it really kills my productivity. My coach encouraged me to try breaking my day into chunks and dedicating, for example, the first chunk to emails, the second to research, and the third into writing. Let me tell you, this has really helped boost my productivity. It's super easy to book a coaching session that's convenient for you. The best way to get started is by going to strawberry.me/42 and taking the short quiz to get matched with a certified coach who's tailored to your needs. So, if you feel stuck in old habits and unable to forward your career, Strawberry.me Career Coaching will help to unlock your full potential. Visit strawberry.me/42 today and start your transformation. And a big thanks to Strawberry.me for sponsoring this video. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. A book penned by the devil? Really? If you're a regular follower of the channel, you'll know I'm somewhat of a skeptic by nature, but debunking the otherworldly, or should I say underworldly, origins of this remarkable book is trickier than you might think, because many aspects of the Codex Gigas' story are honestly kind of baffling, starting with the book itself. Writing a book in the Middle Ages was no joke. It was an incredibly time-intensive job that required a mastery of many different skills: writing, painting, theology, even chemistry. You couldn't just pop down to Staples when you ran out of ink. You had to mix it up yourself. For these reasons, and others, the vast majority of medieval manuscripts were written by several monks working collaboratively over months or even years. But the Codex Gigas is different. Researchers have studied the great book's pages and come to the genuinely mind-blowing conclusion that the largest medieval manuscript in existence was written in its entirety by a single scribe, one with uncommon skill. In the days before the invention of the printing press, books had to be copied out by hand. It was painstaking work, both physically and mentally demanding. Understandably, missing words, spelling errors, and other mistakes were extremely common. The Codex Gigas is a colossal manuscript, and yet it contains no significant errors at all. Now that is surprising, to say the least, especially when you consider how long it must have taken to write the thing. Estimates vary, but most experts believe it would have taken a single author up to 30 years of daily labor to create a book of this size and complexity. That is a mind-boggling level of scholarly endurance. Actually, it's more than just mind-boggling. It's borderline impossible. It isn't just the eerie lack of errors that stands out here. It's the quality of the handwriting itself. It's remarkably consistent from start to finish, and that is extremely hard to explain. On a timescale of decades, a scribe's eyesight, strength, motor control, general health, and skill level, well, it all changes, and that has an impact on his handwriting. The impact may be small or it may be large, but either way, a forensic handwriting analyst would expect to be able to spot it. But with the Codex Gigas, the script on page 1 is utterly indistinguishable from the script on page 620, despite having been laid down decades earlier. Put all of this together, the incredible size of the manuscript, the fact it was written by a single scribe, the quality, consistency, and accuracy of the penmanship, and we're left with a genuine mystery. Whoever made this thing was borderline superhuman. Dare I say it's perhaps even supernatural. Okay, so I don't blame you if you're still firmly settled in Camp Skeptic, but don't rush to any hasty conclusions just yet, because there is more. Take a look at this image here. Do you notice anything strange? The Codex Gigas is written on vellum, most likely made from calfskin. Vellum is typically an off-white colour, exactly like the pages found within the Codex Gigas. Well, most of them. As you can clearly see in this image, the page containing that disturbing depiction of the devil is different. It's darker than the rest, almost as though it's been blackened by fire. The book did once mysteriously survive a fire, more on that in a minute, but so far as we know, its pages have never been burnt. Then there are these two metal fittings on the back cover. Scholars believe they would have been used to physically attach the book to a table at all times. Now, I'm no librarian, but what kind of book needs to be kept chained down? Skeptic or not, you've got to admit, it's all a bit creepy. And the creepiness doesn't stop with the inexplicably charred pages and the physical restraint of inanimate objects, because the 800-year history of this ancient tome is almost as mysterious as the book itself. Going right back to the beginning and putting possible devilish authorship to one side for a moment, nobody actually knows where this giant book came from. The first confirmed owners of the codex were the monks of a small Bohemian monastery called Podlazici. For a long time, historians assumed that this was where the book was made. In fact, most sources still make that claim, but it turns out they're probably wrong. 800 years ago, a book like the Codex Gigas would have been incredibly difficult to produce. Rumour has it 160 individual animals were slaughtered to make the vellum pages, and the giant binding could only have been produced by a master craftsman. It was a highly ambitious project, and it would have cost a small fortune. Actually, scratch that, it would have cost a great big one. But according to researchers at Sweden's National Library, Podlazici Monastery was extremely poor. It simply wouldn't have had the resources to commission a project of this magnitude. So, who did? The answer to that is, we have absolutely no idea. And that's more than a little bit odd. The Codex Gigas was a very famous book right from the start. At one time, it was widely considered to be the 8th wonder of the world. And yet, nobody knows who made it or where it came from. It's almost as though it appeared from nowhere, overnight. The Codex bounced around several monasteries during the first few hundred years of its existence. But in the late 16th century, its growing reputation caught the attention of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. Rudolf was a world-renowned art collector with an unhealthy interest in the occult. With its exquisite illumination and rumoured satanic origins, the Codex Gigas was right up his street. So, he acquired it. Actually, he basically stole it in 1594, and it quickly became the jewel of what is now considered to have been one of the greatest art collections ever assembled. But he wasn't able to enjoy it for long. Because, not long after acquiring the Devil's Bible, Rudolf II lost his mind. The timing here is certainly interesting, but what's even more interesting is the nature of Rudolf's insanity. Prone to bouts of paranoia and inexplicable rage, he claimed to have been possessed by the devil. Coincidence? Perhaps. Either way, apparently it's pretty tricky to rule half of Europe whilst being possessed by the Lord of Darkness, because in the end, Rudy too became such a liability, his own brother overthrew him. The deposed emperor was locked away in Prague Castle along with the Codex Gigas and the rest of his collection. He died there just 9 months later. The Codex was put into storage where it would remain for several decades as the 30 Years' War gripped most of Europe. But a book like this was never going to remain packed away in a box for long. Like Rudolf II, Queen Christina of Sweden was a famous patron of the arts, and she had a special interest in books. During the latter part of the 30 Years' War, her generals realised they could gain favour with the young queen by sending her valuable artwork, particularly books, seized as spoils of war from collections all across Europe. And no book in all of Christendom was more valuable than the Codex Gigas. In 1648, a Swedish army sacked the city of Prague in what proved to be the last action of the war. The primary motivation for the entire attack was to loot Rudolf II's collection, and the Codex Gigas in particular. In other words, countries have quite literally waged war for this thing. Queen Christina stored the Codex Gigas in her castle in Stockholm, known as Tre Krona, meaning 3 crowns. The mighty castle had stood for around 4 centuries at that point, but fewer than 50 years after the arrival of the Codex, almost the entire thing burnt to the ground in a freak fire. 75% of the books in the castle library were destroyed. Yet, despite the fact it weighed 75 kilos and was probably chained to a desk at the time, the Codex Gigas survived. As for how, rumour has it some Codex Giga-Chad somehow managed to chuck it out of a window whilst the library burned, hitting some poor sod on the way down. Historians are divided on whether that part actually happened, but there is some damage to the book's binding consistent with a fall from a significant height. Now, before we move on, it's random interesting fact time. After that castle burned down, the fire marshal on duty was found guilty of negligence for not discovering the conflagration earlier. For his punishment, he was forced to run between 2 rows of people whilst being clubbed, whipped, and punched from all sides. It proved to be fatal. Now, there's a good chance you've never heard of this admittedly somewhat bizarre form of military punishment, but I'm willing to bet you know what it's called. Running the gauntlet. Despite the fact it died out almost 200 years ago, the name lives on as a common idiom. Anyway, the books that did survive the Tre Krona conflagration were eventually rehoused in the Swedish National Library, where the Codex Gigas can still be found to this day. Right, okay, let's take stock. I think it's fair to say at this point that this is one hell of a weird book. The unknown origin, the uncannily skilled scribe, the blackened pages, the mad emperor, the list goes on. But let's face it, you'd have to be on some pretty strong crack to believe that the devil himself actually wrote this thing. So what's really going on here? How do we explain all the peculiarities of this strange story? Let's start at one of the creepiest elements of the whole case. Those strangely blackened pages showing a depiction of the devil. You may have guessed that the Codex happens to be open on that page during the fire at Tre Krona Castle. But the truth is actually even simpler than that. You see, when you expose vellum to sunlight, it develops a distinctive dark patina. Under normal circumstances, that patina would be relatively uniform across an entire book. But since one particular page of the Codex Gigas is so much more famous than all the others, it has had far more than its fair share of sunlight. It's almost poetic, really. The pages of the Devil's Codex weren't blackened by hellfire, they were stained by centuries of human fascination. The fact that the Codex was apparently kept chained down at all times is even easier to explain. It certainly gives this story a monster book of monsters vibe, but it turns out it was actually just standard practice. This was a time when even normal books were incredibly valuable. It wasn't unusual for entire libraries to be chained to their shelves. The Codex Gigas was basically priceless, so keeping it under lock and key just made sense. Then there's poor old Rudolf II. He did indeed go insane not long after acquiring the Codex. Then again, he wasn't the only Habsburg ruler to misplace his marbles. This was one of the most hilariously inbred families in all of human history. You've probably already noticed a characteristic Habsburg chin like a fucking sledgehammer. All sorts of disabilities, both mental and physical, plagued that bloodline. As for the rest, the Codex was one of the few books to survive the fire in Tre Krona Castle, because it makes sense to save the most valuable objects first, even if they do weigh a ton. And nobody knows who made it because it's 800 years old and the Middle Ages aren't exactly known as the golden age of record keeping. If you're starting to notice a pattern here, that's because there absolutely is one. The strange stories that surround the Codex certainly lend the great book an air of mystery. But examine any one of them a little closer and there's a perfectly reasonable explanation just waiting to be uncovered. But just because no infernal intervention is required to explain how the Codex Gigas came to be, that doesn't mean there is no mystery to this tall tale. Because if Satan didn't pen the Codex Gigas with his own clawed hand, That means a regular old sack of meat Homo sapiens somehow managed it. The book you see before you is the life's work of one truly remarkable individual. As for who that individual was, we still don't know for sure, but it turns out that the manuscript itself, along with the legend, may hold a clue. The second page of the Codex Gigas contains, amongst other things, an obituary note for a monk named Herman Inclusus, which roughly translates to Herman the Recluse in English. There's a good chunk of speculation involved here, but some scholars believe stay-at-home Herman may have been the original author of the Codex. But since we're speculating, let's take things one step further, because it turns out there's more than one way of translating the Latin word inclusus. It can also mean confined. Is it possible that the legend is true, at least in part? Was the Codex Gigas written over many decades by a monk, Herman, who committed some terrible crime for which he was locked away, not inside a monastery wall, but a simple cell? Could the legend of the devil and the damned monk be a kind of folk memory based on the true story of the Codex's creation? The truth is, we'll likely never know for sure. The heroes and villains of this great tale have been dead for close to a millennium. But regardless of who put quill to paper all those years ago, the Codex Gigas is undeniably one of the greatest books ever conceived. A literary cathedral built one word at a time by an almost unbelievably talented and dedicated individual. Well, it's either that or it's the debut novel of the devil himself. I'll let you decide which ending you prefer. Thanks for watching.